At a quiet cemetery, a mysterious elderly woman steps forward during the funeral of a beloved community leader and reveals a truth that leaves everyone speechless. Hidden love, unclaimed fatherhood, secret sacrifices, and a legacy built in silence. This is not just a story about death. It's a story about what we choose to leave behind and who chooses to carry it. Welcome to one of the most powerful stories you'll hear today. The midday sun cast long shadows over Elmwood Rest Cemetery, the kind of place where silence wrapped around you like a second skin. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, leaves rustling gently in the wind as mourners stood around a polished mahogany casket. The name engraved on the gleaming black headstone read, Dr. Everett Langston, a life of dignity and devotion. To the gathered crowd, Everett had been a respected philanthropist, a former university dean, a man whose name graced buildings and scholarship funds. Men adjusted their ties, women clutched handkerchiefs, and the air was filled with murmurs of fond remembrance. But standing at the far edge of the gathering, separate and almost invisible, was a woman no one seemed to know. She was black, elderly, and wore a long burgundy coat, the collar pulled close around her neck. A wide-brimmed hat shielded most of her silver-streaked hair. In her gloved hands, she held a single yellow rose. As the final prayer ended, she stepped forward. Her heels clicked softly on the gravel, and a hush fell over the crowd. Without hesitation, she laid the rose atop the casket and turned. "My name," she said calmly, "is Ruth Annalise Carter, and I knew the Everett better than any of you." The crowd stiffened. Murmurs swirled like smoke. A few heads turned toward one another in confusion. Who was this woman? Everett Langston had been a public figure for decades. Surely someone as close as she claimed to be wouldn't have been absent from the usual narratives. Ruth's posture didn't falter. Her hands remained folded before her, eyes focused not on any one person, but the group as a whole. "I know many of you believe you came here today to bury a great man," she continued, "and you did. But you also came here not knowing the truth about who Everett really was." A tall man near the front, wearing a navy wool coat and a look of suspicion, frowned. "I've known Everett since grad school," he whispered to his wife. "I've never heard her name." Ruth gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "That's because the Everett Langston I knew didn't live for the spotlight. He lived for people, especially the ones the world didn't want to see." The silence thickened. "And before this day ends," she added, her voice steady, "you're going to know the truth about his battles, his heartbreaks, and the son he was never allowed to claim." "You see," Ruth said, her voice now carrying across the gravesite, "I met Everett in 1969 in Montgomery, Alabama. Back then, he wasn't Dr. Langston or Dean Langston. He was just Everett, 24, idealistic, and too stubborn for his own good." Her words cut through the chilly air. Even the rustling trees seemed to quiet. He was one of only 3 white men who dared walk through the doors of the Bethel Baptist Church during our organizing meetings. I was 21 then, a nursing student and part of the local NAACP chapter. And I still remember how he looked, nervous but determined. A low ripple moved through the crowd. Some people shifted their weight. Others looked away. We planned sit-ins. We marched. And every time we did, Everett was there. He lost friends for it. His own father disowned him. He slept on a cot behind the church for 6 months because he had nowhere else to go. Ruth paused and glanced at the polished casket beside her. But not once did he complain. A man at the back of the crowd, an older professor, looked stunned. "He never talked about any of this," he whispered. Ruth smiled sadly, because Everett never wanted applause. He wanted change. "But it wasn't just the movement that brought us together," Ruth continued, her voice softening. "We were 2 people who had no business loving each other in the eyes of the world, but did anyway." The crowd fell into a deeper silence. Even the distant chirping of birds seemed to hush. "He and I," Ruth hesitated, her eyes brimming, "we fell in love during a time when our kind of love could cost lives. And it did cost us, his job, my scholarship, friendships on both sides." She looked toward a woman in a gray dress clutching a funeral program. "He was offered a university job in New York in 1972, but he turned it down. 'They wouldn't let me bring you,' he told me. So he stayed." Gasps stirred through the group. For nearly 5 years, we built a life behind closed doors. We cooked together, read together, grieved together, but always in the shadows. One woman whispered, "Everett was engaged once, wasn't he?" Ruth nodded. "Yes, but that ended when he told her the truth." Her hands trembled, but her voice stayed firm. "He never stopped loving me. Not even after we lost everything. Not even when the world forced him to choose silence over scandal." A soft breeze blew through the cemetery, carrying the scent of earth and fallen leaves. Ruth let the pause linger. Her hands reached into her purse and pulled out a small, creased envelope. "This," she said, "is a letter Everett wrote to me in 1975. He never meant for anyone else to read it, but today, I think he'd want you to hear it." She unfolded the letter with care, as if it were made of gold leaf. "My dearest Ruth," she began reading, her voice steady but tender. "I used to think that love needed witnesses, that it wasn't real unless the world could see it. But I was wrong. Love is most real when it exists without condition, when it survives in silence." The crowd stood frozen. "I wish I could give you the life you deserve, one where we could hold hands in the light instead of whispering in the dark. But if I must choose between silence with you and applause without you, I'll choose silence every time." Ruth's voice cracked. "You are my home, Ruth, even if the world never knows it." She folded the letter slowly, looking out at the stunned crowd. "And now," she whispered, "you finally know." Ruth's voice settled over the crowd like dusk, gentle, but impossible to ignore. "After that letter, we kept our promise to each other. We stayed close, but careful. And then in the summer of 1908, everything changed." She took a deep breath. "I became pregnant." The gasp from the crowd was audible this time. A few mourners exchanged shocked glances. Others froze in disbelief. "Everett was overjoyed," Ruth continued, her voice tinged with both sorrow and strength. "He wanted to shout it from every rooftop, tell every soul on the street, but he knew what it meant. A biracial child, born out of wedlock to an activist couple in Alabama, that wasn't just taboo, that was a target." She turned her gaze to the casket. "He made a choice, a heartbreaking one. For my safety and for our child's future, he didn't claim us publicly. He helped me move to Atlanta under a different name. He visited when he could, sent letters and money, and stayed connected. In secret." A woman near the back covered her mouth. "You mean Everett had a child?" Ruth nodded slowly. "A son," she said, "and he's here with me today." The crowd shifted, parting instinctively as a tall man stepped forward from the back. He moved with quiet confidence, broad-shouldered, dressed in a simple black suit, his expression unreadable. But his eyes, they held the same fire Everett once did. "This is my son," Ruth said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "This is Elijah Langston." A ripple of astonishment passed through the mourners. Some gasped, others simply stared. It wasn't just his presence. It was the resemblance, the jawline, the posture, the calm, commanding presence. He didn't just look like Everett, he felt like him. Elijah stepped beside his mother and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Thank you, Mom," he said softly, then turned to face the crowd. "My father was many things to many people," he began. "But to me he was a shadow, a letter, a voice on the phone, a guardian who never stepped fully into the light, not because he didn't want to, but because he couldn't." He paused, his gaze sweeping the mourners. "Some of you knew him as a benefactor, some as a friend. I knew him as the man who gave up everything to protect the two people he loved most." The wind picked up, rustling the leaves at their feet. Elijah's voice remained strong. "My father never missed a birthday," he said, "never missed a milestone, even if he couldn't be there in person. He sent me recordings, books, poems, anything to remind me that I mattered, even if the world couldn't know why." He glanced at the casket and his voice softened. "I used to resent him. I didn't understand why I was a secret, why other kids had their dads at school plays or graduations, and I just had envelopes. But then I found his journals." The crowd collectively leaned in. "In those pages," Elijah continued, "he wrote about me constantly. He wrote about the fear of what would happen if anyone found out. Not to him, but to me. He knew the world would treat me differently because of who I was and who he was. And so he chose to love me from the shadows. Ruth stood silently beside her son, her face a portrait of pride and pain. And now, Elijah said, his voice breaking just slightly, he doesn't have to hide anymore. Tears ran freely now, from strangers, friends, and former colleagues alike. Elijah stepped back, giving Ruth space once more. She took it, her voice steady despite the storm around her. Everett's life wasn't measured by his titles, she said, but by his sacrifices. She looked directly at a group of suited men standing near the front, board members from a foundation that bore Everett's name. Their faces were pale, their expressions unreadable. You put him on pedestals, Ruth said, named libraries after him, but none of you ever asked what he gave up to become that man. A beat passed. When he was offered tenure at Eastwood University, he almost turned it down because the offer came with a clause forbidding associations that might draw controversy. He accepted only after rewriting the policy, alone in a room full of men who didn't think he belonged. Ruth took a slow breath. And when a black student was nearly expelled for protesting, Everett stood up for him, not in front of cameras but behind closed doors, risking his position once again. She looked back at the casket. He didn't do those things for legacy. He did them because he couldn't stand injustice, not even in silence. Ruth reached once more into her purse and pulled out a second letter, yellowed by time, folded neatly. This was the last letter Everett wrote to Elijah, she said. He sent it just 2 weeks before he died. She unfolded the fragile paper, her hands trembling. My son, she read, I hope one day the world will be kind enough for you to speak my name freely. But if that day never comes, I want you to know I have loved you more than any title, any position, any peace I might have earned in this life. Her voice cracked. I was not brave enough to be your father in the light, but I was never absent in the dark. You have always been my greatest joy and my deepest sorrow. Ruth paused to gather herself. Live loud, my boy. Fight fair, and know that even when the world didn't deserve our love, we gave it anyway. And that's what makes us unbreakable. She folded the letter with reverence and held it to her chest. You all thought you knew Everett Langston, Ruth said, but until today you only knew the man the world allowed you to see. As Ruth stepped back, a deep silence settled over the mourners. No longer just a crowd, but a room of witnesses. The polished image of Everett Langston was beginning to dissolve, revealing a man whose greatness had been forged in private sacrifice, not public accolades. Elijah wasn't Everett's only act of quiet rebellion, Ruth said. He gave his wealth to the public, but his true legacy was what he did with the final years of his life. She reached into her coat and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope marked, The Langston Foundation Trust. 2 months before he passed, she continued, Everett called me. He was tired, but his mind was still sharp. He said, I've spent a lifetime building other people's dreams. It's time to build something they can carry. She turned the envelope toward the board members and faculty in the front row. This trust, Ruth announced, was established for the children of this city, black, white, and everything in between. Scholarships, mentorships, emergency funds, all privately funded by the man whose name you used but whose pain you never knew. The crowd stirred. Several guests looked visibly ashamed. He didn't ask for applause, Ruth said again. He asked for action, and now, it's your move. Elijah stepped forward again, his voice low but commanding. My father's final request, he said, was that none of this be made public until today. He wanted people to feel the weight of his truth, not just read about it in a press release. He turned to face the board members, then the gathered crowd. That trust is already active. The first 20 students have already received acceptance letters and tuition coverage. Mentors have been matched, and more are coming. A woman near the front clutched her chest. My niece got one of those letters, she whispered. She thought it was a mistake. No mistake, Elijah replied. My father meant every single one. Ruth looked around, her expression softer now. For a man who spent his life hiding his deepest love, she said, he made sure to leave a legacy no one could ignore. A tearful man in the back finally spoke. Why didn't he tell us? Why didn't he ever say? Ruth sighed. Because he didn't believe love needed a stage. He believed love needed hands and hearts and courage. She glanced at Elijah. And Everett loved this city, even when it didn't love him back. The crowd lowered their heads, realizing what they'd missed for decades. A few steps from the casket, a young teacher raised her hand, timidly, as though unsure whether she had the right to speak. "I met Everett once," she said, "at a fundraiser for underfunded schools. I was fresh out of college. And he stayed after everyone left just to ask how I was doing. Not about money, just how I was holding up." Ruth nodded gently. "That was him." The woman continued, voice shaking. "He handed me a check, said it was for art supplies for my students. I never knew where it came from. It just showed up every month after that." Others began to murmur now, stories bubbling up. The security guard, who got a call the day after his son was arrested and found a lawyer had already been hired. A woman whose rent had been paid by an anonymous donor. A teenager who'd been tutored anonymously through email until he got into college. Piece by piece, Everett Langston's secret life of service came into view. And still Ruth stood tall. "Now you see why he never wanted a eulogy," she said. "He didn't need his name in lights. He needed it written quietly on the hearts of the people he served." A chill swept through the cemetery as clouds briefly covered the sun, casting the headstone in shadow. Ruth took a breath, steadying herself as the weight of the moment pressed against her chest. "There's one more thing you should know," she said. "The final thing Everett told me before he passed." The crowd leaned in, silent. He said, "If they never remember my name, let them remember the feeling of being seen." Her voice trembled, not from weakness, but from truth carried too long alone. He was tired of being a hero to people who never asked about his scars, of being praised by people who only saw the results, not the ruin behind them. Ruth turned toward the casket. "I was with him when he died," she said. "I held his hand. And in his final hour, he didn't ask for recognition. He asked if I thought Elijah would forgive him." She paused. "I told him there was nothing to forgive." Elijah stepped forward once more. "And I meant it," he said. "I forgave him not because he was perfect, but because he tried, even when it broke him." The cemetery held still, holding the truth like sacred scripture. The sun re-emerged from behind the clouds, casting a golden hue over Everett Langston's casket. Ruth looked down at it, her hand brushing the smooth surface one last time. "I told him I'd tell the truth," she said quietly, "no matter how long it took. And now I have." She turned to face the mourners again, no longer just a crowd of strangers. Their silence was not judgment now. It was reverence. "You see," Ruth said, "we all carry parts of people that the world never gets to know. Today you've met the Everett Langston I knew, the one who hid in alleys to protect protesters, the one who wrote bedtime stories on cassette tapes, the one who gave everything so others could rise." She reached for Elijah's hand. "And now we ask only this, that you don't let his story end here." Elijah nodded, stepping forward one last time. "Honor him by building something, by seeing someone, by choosing courage when it's easier to be quiet." The crowd bowed their heads, not by instruction, but instinct. Everett Langston had been laid to rest, but the truth of who he was had just begun to rise. As the mourners stood in reflective silence, a teenage boy stepped forward from the back. He looked no older than 16, skinny, nervous, holding a wrinkled notebook to his chest. His voice cracked when he spoke. "My name's Jordan. I never met Dr. Langston in person, but he changed my life." The crowd shifted, giving him space. His fingers trembled, but his eyes were steady. "My mom died 2 years ago. I was failing school. I didn't think I'd make it. Then one day a package showed up. Books, journals, and a letter." He opened his notebook and began to read. "Jordan, I don't know you yet, but I believe in who you can become. You're not invisible. You're not forgotten. The world may not bend for you, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't walk tall." He looked up, blinking away tears. "That letter got me back on my feet. I'm graduating next spring. I'm going to college. Because someone believed in me, someone who never even met me." Gasps and tears flowed freely. Everett Langston hadn't just left behind policies and programs. He left behind hope. And in the face of that truth, the world as they knew it began to change. As Jordan stepped back, Ruth gently placed her arm around the boy's shoulder. "You're exactly why Everett did what he did," she whispered. The crowd was no longer a group of disconnected faces. They were participants in a legacy, a living testimony to one man's quiet, revolutionary love. An elderly woman near the front, her cane planted firmly in the soil, cleared her throat. "I knew Everett in 1971, she said. "I was a newly widowed mother of 4. He came to our neighborhood every Saturday with groceries and no camera. He told me, 'This isn't charity, it's family.'" More voices followed. A former student, now a university dean, confessed that Everett had paid for his father's surgery when insurance denied coverage. A pastor admitted that Everett once slipped cash into his Bible after learning about a struggling congregation member. Even the skeptical board member from earlier stepped forward, choking back emotion. "I thought I knew Everett," he said, voice cracking, "but I never saw this." Ruth turned to him. "That's because he never asked you to. He didn't need to be seen. He needed to be felt." And now, for the first time, the full weight of Everett Langston's life had come into focus. The sun now hung low in the sky, casting golden light over the cemetery and bathing Everett's headstone in a soft glow. Ruth took a breath, slow, deep, steady, as she walked toward the front for one last time. "This headstone," she said, "will tell people Everett Langston lived, but not how he loved, not how he fought, not what he gave up." She turned to the crowd. "That part is up to you." A quiet murmur passed through the mourners. "Elijah and I, we've already started," she continued. "The Langston Trust will continue growing. We've partnered with local schools and clinics. We've committed to mentoring 50 young people this year alone." She paused, then added, "But what will you do? Will you just go home and return to your lives unchanged? Or will you carry forward the love Everett gave you, whether you knew it or not?" The question lingered, and for once it wasn't rhetorical. One by one, hands went up. Volunteers, teachers, donors, neighbors. Some were weeping, some stood silent, moved beyond words. But the answer was clear. Everett's work wasn't finished. It had only just begun. Through them. Through all of them. A few children ran between the tombstones in the distance, laughter echoing faintly as the adults watched with gentle smiles. The atmosphere had changed. What began as a funeral had become something else entirely. A rebirth. Elijah stepped forward for the final time, standing beside his mother. "My father didn't believe legacy was something you own," he said. "He believed it was something you shared. He didn't want his name remembered. He wanted his impact remembered." He looked at the younger guests in the crowd. "He once told me, 'If one child walks into a classroom believing they matter, then I've done something right.'" His gaze returned to the casket. "Dad, you did so many things right." Ruth's eyes shone with tears, but her hands were steady. "We used to sit on the porch in Atlanta," she said. "He'd hold my hand and tell me that real love doesn't ask for anything but the chance to give." She touched the side of the casket gently. "You gave, Everett, and we saw it. We feel it." A long silence followed, filled not with grief, but with a sacred kind of peace. The kind that only comes when the truth has finally been told. The sun dipped just below the horizon, casting long amber streaks across the cemetery lawn. The mourners, now a community united by revelation, began to gather near the casket, not in silence but in gratitude. Some laid flowers, others whispered prayers. One small child, no older than 6, set down a crayon drawing labeled, "Thank you, Mr. Langston." Ruth and Elijah stood together, hand in hand, their silhouettes framed by the warm light. Ruth took a deep breath and turned to the group one last time. "If Everett taught me anything," she said, "it's that love isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's hidden, but it's always there." She stepped away slowly, the breeze catching the hem of her coat. "Go live like he did," Elijah said. "Go lift somebody. Go make someone feel seen." And with that, they walked together down the stone path, leaving behind not just a grave, but a beginning of a story the world almost never heard, a beginning born from silence, sacrifice, and the kind of love that never dies. The crowd did not applaud. They simply watched, and quietly they vowed to live lives that mattered, just like Everett Langston. Legacy is not built on titles, but on sacrifices made in silence. Everett Langston taught us that the greatest acts of love often go unnoticed, yet they are the ones that change lives forever. True impact isn't about recognition. It's about lifting others, protecting what matters, and choosing quiet courage over comfort.